So I'm going to now introduce our featured speaker. So Dr. Vinay Lal, UCLA professor of history and Asian American studies, was introduced a little bit by Kathy at the beginning. I just wanted to say that his most recent book is called The Fury of COVID-19, The Politics, Histories, and Unrequited Love of the Coronavirus. He's speaking on the theme today, the global turn to authoritarianism, the perils, promise, and the prospects for democracy. Dr. Lal contends that since the Cold War and the breakup of the Soviet Union, the global world order has taken a turn to authoritarianism, even in established democracies such as the United States, as evidenced by the attack on the United States Capitol on January 6, and in democracies such as India, Poland, Turkey, Hungary, Brazil, and the Philippines. Dr. Lal's talk today will provide a framework for us to view this historical struggle between the thirst for power and the thirst for justice. As an aside, when I was first starting to talk to Dr. Lal about speaking at one of our meetings back in February, his schedule was tentative due to research-related travel he was scheduling both within the United States and outside the United States to India, and because it was being held up due to COVID-19 restrictions. At the time, it was bad in LA and good in India. Little did he know that the reverse would be happening now. Please welcome Dr. Lal.
Thank you very much, Anne, for the introduction, and my thanks to the Palos Verdes Democrats for this invitation, and to Asha for facilitating it as well, Asha Shahid. So let me suggest to you what the outline of the talk will be. This talk today is segmented into 5 parts. And as you will see, I'm not going to be talking merely about the United States or only about the United States. I think the little synopsis that was offered to you suggests that the purview of this talk is, the ambit of this talk is much larger. In fact, it's really the subject of a book in a way. And I do hope actually to be doing a couple of books related to the subject matter of this talk in the coming years. So the 5 parts, the first is to very briefly explore the meaning of the end of the Cold War as it was conventionally understood, and the triumphant feeling that the world order established at the end of the World War would in fact be consolidated. That was the sentiment at that time in 1990-91, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the Soviet Union. Secondly, with respect to the contemporary, so that's the second part, rather than beginning with the United States, I'm going to actually look at what has happened and what continues to happen in Myanmar, or Burma, the other name by which it is known. Thirdly, I will then turn to the events of January 6th in the US and interrogate them both from the standpoint of the long past and the implications of these events for the immediate future. Fourthly, by way of providing an understanding of what I have termed the global turn to authoritarianism, I would look at politics in India in some detail. And then finally, in the last part of this talk, I will offer some speculations on democracy, its perils, its promise, and its prospects. So moving immediately to the first part of this talk, I'm sure that many of you will recall the triumphant kind of feeling that emerged in 1989, 90, 91, when we witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then eventually, shortly following that, the collapse of what was called the Soviet Union. And the collapse of the Soviet Union was not simply the collapse of a regime, it also meant that, in fact, all the satellite states, if we may call them such, of the Soviet Union, that is, those countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact, all of them, of course, also saw liberation movements known by various names. The Velvet Revolution, for example, we had an uprising in Romania, we had one in Poland, and so on. Right? So that was essentially the state of affairs for a couple of years. And at that time, a number of commentators about whom some of us were critical. I was writing about politics about 35 years ago. And when Samuel Huntington came out with his thesis on the clash of civilizations, which, to be quite blunt about it, someone like myself and some other commentators of a certain disposition always thought of as a kind of a juvenile statement. But when you're an accomplished Harvard political scientist, your name carries weight. And he had put forward this thesis about the clash of civilizations, that this is what the fault line would be. There would be, and one of those fault lines would, of course, be Islam. That Islam was going to be, so to speak, even though he didn't put it in so many words, it was going to be a, a problem as such for the United States and for the modern world. Right? The other commentator of a similar disposition who wrote a piece that became extremely famous was Francis Fukuyama. He started with a small piece which came out in a journal called The National Interest, and then eventually it morphed into a whole book. And it was essentially an argument about what he called the end of history. Now we need to understand the nature of that argument to see where he went wrong right at the outset and what some of the problems are when you're really working from the vantage point of the West. Because when you're working from the vantage point of the West, it means very often that you're actually unable to see what's happening on the ground in other parts of the world. Whether you're able to see what's happening on the ground in your own country is still another matter. But what's interesting here is that what was the argument about the end of history? Essentially, it was a twofold argument. One, that liberal democracy was now bound to be the norm in most countries, because even where there wasn't any liberal democracy, we would see people aspire to that. And so therefore, for example, moving forward 20 years later, it seemed to many that what is called the Arab Spring was precisely that, right? An aspiration for people in that part of the world, in the Middle East, among the Arab peoples, the people of Egypt and Libya, for example, to aspire to democracy. But of course, the supposition here was that liberal democracy, as it was known in the West, was a model that countries should actually emulate. Now, of course, you could argue from hindsight and say that, well, really, should it be a model that countries should emulate, considering what happened in the United States on January? Moreover, is what happened on January 6th simply an anomaly? Or is it, in fact, very much part of the history of this country? Right? But this is a question that I'll turn to later on. And I should give what's called a trigger warning. Much of what I'm going to say is going to be very unpleasant. In a sense, it's going to be unpleasant for all of you as Democrats, because I believe that the Democrats have also been complicit in much of the history that I'm going to talk about. It's going to be unpleasant as Americans, and it's going to be unpleasant most fundamentally as people who I believe all of you unquestionably are, who are interested in the world at large, right? And therefore understand that we cannot speak of the United States simply in isolation and attempt to understand what's happening here without having a sense of what place the US occupies in the world imagination and what place the world occupies in the American imagination, right? Both, right? So one argument of Samuel Huntington was, and Francis Fukuyama in particular, was this argument that, well, in fact, we have achieved the end of history because liberal democracy is the apotheosis. It is the citadel. And all countries are either at the citadel or they will arrive at that citadel. And of course, the corollary, that's a second argument, was that you cannot, in fact, actually have liberal democracy unless it is also accompanied by the correlative, namely an economic system which goes along with liberal democracy, namely capitalism. And of course, the phrase by which, people such as myself scholars understand capitalism as also, we use another phrase, which is the free market economy. So the implication here was that, well, actually, it is a free market economy which is really fundamentally the culmination of what it means to be human, right? I mean, so therefore, if I may put it in a slightly mocking tone, the great ambition here is that we should all learn to be very good consumers and be able to distinguish between 500 brands of cereal, which are essentially three cereals masquerading as 500. And that's ultimately the apotheosis of human civilization, is to become people who become consumers and partake of the free market economy. And of course, in America, it's very difficult to critique that, because the minute you even raise the slightest criticism, you will be thrown out of hand, either as a socialist and much worse as something called a Marxist or a communist, right? The way in which the Republicans speak about how this country has been taken over by radical Marxists. I mean, if there was ever a laughable proposition, that would have to be one, that this country has been taken over by the radical left. Because of course, from the standpoint of the radical left, there is no left in America to begin with, much less a radical left, right? So it really depends on the vantage point from which you're looking really at all of these questions. Now, there was a third implication, which goes back to Samuel Huntington. And that was that, yes, the Cold War had ended tentatively. At that point, it wasn't understood that the Soviet Union would morph into Russia, which would be very much like the old Soviet Union, except that there would be capitalism too. That there would be cronies or people in power, or people like Putin, who would accumulate massive fortunes of the kind that American billionaires have accumulated, right? But that wasn't known, of course, in 1991, 1992, when someone like Boris Yeltsin seemed to usher in a new era into Russian politics. But there was another concern, and that's the third consideration. That was Muslim rage. The phrase is not mine, I didn't invent it. A very famous or infamous academic at Princeton University, the late Bernard Lewis, wrote a long article in the Atlantic called The Roots of Muslim Rage. And there the argument was that, well, actually the Islamic world is about to unleash, war on us, because we don't understand the rage that has been building up in these countries. Now, this is not a talk really on the future of Islam, the relationship between Islam and modernity, Islam and politics, and all of that. So I won't get into the details of the argument. But what I really do want to stress is the fact that this was very much part of the public discourse. And of course, if one were a discerning observer, one would have noticed right from the outset that all of these propositions were in fact contradicted by American conduct itself. Because, for example, what did the US do? It got into another series of wars. The Gulf Wars, invasion of Afghanistan, invasion of Iraq. And the people who were behind that, of course, orchestrated what was really called the new American policy, a new kind of American realism. And this new realism, in fact, implicitly assumed that even though the Cold War had ended, the United States had to remain prepared in a state of perpetual warfare. Right? That was, in fact, the presumption behind all of this. All right. So this is simply the first set of propositions to lay the backdrop for understanding what really is transpiring in our time. Because I need to say what my position is, that I do think that we are, in fact, actually at a very critical turn. We're at a very critical turn because, at least from the standpoint of a scholar and a historian, when I look back on the long past, the very, very long past, what I'm also seeing is a situation which is very much like what we saw between World War I and World War II, particularly in the late 1920s, minus, of course, the Great Depression. But if you look at Weimar Germany, for example, right, the Weimar Republic, and you look at what was transpiring there, what we're really seeing is a very ominous turn of events worldwide, not just in the United States. Right? Now, let me turn to in the second part, let me turn to Burma. I'm going to use the old name Burma rather than Myanmar. There's a politics of which name one uses, but I'll just go along with the older name, Burma, which is a country in Southeast Asia, as most of you are aware, uh, with a population of approximately 55 million. Now, from 1962, so Burma was a British colony. It was actually ruled really by the British from India. And there's a very interesting history, which I can't really get into, which has to do with the history of Indian traders and one community in particular who were actually, a dominant force in Burma's economy for a period of time, right? But when Burma acquires independence around the same time as does India, the leader of Burma's independence movement was the father of Aung San Suu Kyi, who is, of course, the icon of modern day Burma in many ways. A very interesting and troubled figure. I'll get to her in just a few moments, right? So 1962, there was a coup in Burma, and this coup uttered in about 50 years of military rule. They began to effect a very slow transition in Burma to something like quasi-civilian rule, a very slow transition in 2011. This transition became accelerated in 2016 when there was a kind of a hybrid military civilian government that came into power. Okay, so you had a military head of state, but then you also had Aung San Suu Kyi, who had been in fact actually imprisoned for well over a decade by the Burmese military. There is a restoration of power to her and the political party that she stood for, which is the National League for Democracy, or the NLD, as it's known. But even in this 2016 agreement, the military retained an automatic right to 1/4 of all the seats in the Burmese parliament. Right now, in November 2020, they had an election, so just about 6 months ago. This election not simply restored the kind of authority, the moral authority that Aung San Suu Kyi had in the eyes of the public in Burma. What it in fact actually did was it further strengthened the NLD because they won 396 out of 476 seats. So an overwhelming majority. The party representing the military won only 33 seats. And here's a little aside. I'm going to offer a few asides because these asides themselves tell us something about the culture of politics. So the party that represents the military is called the Union Solidarity and Development Party. You know that whenever you encounter a name like that, you should always assume that it stands for the opposite. Union Solidarity and Development Party. It's like the Committee for Public Safety after the French Revolution, if you remember your history, right? The Committee for Public Safety, which was a committee initiated by the Jacobins. And the sole purpose of that committee was to inflict a regime of terror. But it's called the Committee for Public Safety. So whenever many people say this is Orwellian, yeah, but this goes back to much before the time of George Orwell. People have been savvy about these things for 200 years, how you use names and use them with a certain kind of twist. All right. Now, in the event, the critical thing is that November 2020 elections indicated very clearly to the military that what the people of Burma wanted was a complete transition to civilian rule, because Aung San Suu Kyi's party, right, and she's the daughter, as I said earlier, of the founding father of Burma, Aung San. He was sort of the principal freedom fighter, right? And rather than obviously acceding to the results, the day before the members of the new parliament were to be sworn in, the military effected a coup d'etat. So on February 1st, there was a coup d'etat in Myanmar, and we are still now in the midst of that, because what you have now is complete military rule, you have martial law, right? And of course, in response to that, there has been a pro-democracy movement. I'll get to that later on in a different section when I look at what are the ways in which we would have to think about reviving democracy and its prospects. But I do want to look very briefly at some of the strategies used by the police state, because that's what it is effectively. It's a military and a police state. That's what you have in Burma. And of course, one of the things they did immediately was they put up an internet wall. This is something that they have learned, of course, from the Chinese, how to really effectively use that. You know that the telecommunications in Burma, the entire system is set up almost entirely by the Chinese. There are two mega Chinese multinationals, so Huawei and EZT. These are the two companies that really have been responsible for installing the telecommunication systems. And as in much of Africa, development projects are almost entirely initiated by the Chinese in Burma. The Americans have very little footprint in Burma, almost none whatsoever. All right. But you know but all of these regimes are cunning in their own way. So, for example, one of the things they did, I mean, when I read about it, it was really astonishing until I realized what was going on. That one of the things that the regime did after effecting the coup was they issued an amnesty and they released 23,000 prisoners in one fell sweep, immediately 23,000. Well, why are they releasing 23,000 prisoners? Because these are not political prisoners and they need to fill their jails with political prisoners. And of course, one of the reasons they release these 23,000 convicted criminals who are not political prisoners is precisely because what they want to do is they want to sow a different kind of disorder. So it's a combination of order, which is a military order, and a different kind of disorder within the civilian ranks, okay, within civil society, right? The police lit fires, for example, in Rangoon or Yangon, as it's known, and Mandalay, and the idea was to draw out people from their homes into the streets, because many people, of course, had gone into hiding, many people who became important figures in the pro-democracy movement. Now, what else do we need to know about Burma in order to understand why it's important? What was the US response? You can imagine what it was. The US, of course, denounced the coup, as did all the Western powers. Countries like India also expressed concern, to use the phrase that is used, right? And of course, the US imposed financial sanctions on some of the principal figures in the military administration, in the State Administration Council, as it's called. So they created a new council. It's called the State Administration Council. But this is, of course, a completely toothless response. It's a toothless response because many of these people no longer have bank accounts in the US. Most of them have their assets in offshore places. They have them in Switzerland. They have them in many other places. And I think the US response in Burma, which has had absolutely no restraining effect on Burma at all, shows very clearly the impotency of the US as a world power, at least in these respects, right? Whether it should exercise, power is a different consideration. But I'm saying that given that the US, of course, is still billed as the world's eminent superpower, it's astonishing that its writ does not run at all, even in countries such as Myanmar. And in fact, if anything, I would argue that the after the sanctions were imposed, if anything, what the State Administration Council did was it actually unleashed more violence on the protesters, right? And so what you've had in Burma is you've had a large number of civilian deaths. I mean, as of mid-April, we're talking about 700 people killed in live police firings, right? Over 700 people killed and civilians killed. The number now would be closer to 1,000, and of course, thousands more who have been wounded and arrested. But there are a number of other interesting things about it too. So Russia has a hand in all of this as well, partly because the training of military officials of Burma is largely undertaken not in China, but in Russia. So you have China being the major power, with respect to development projects, with telecommunications and all of that, but with respect to the military training of officials, the Burmese still tend to go to Russia. One or two more considerations before I wind up my discussion of Burma and come to the United States. One thing that is not mentioned often in the American press, and it's not mentioned because most journalists obviously simply skim the surface, as it were. You have to have some real deep acquaintance with the history of Burma. If you ask me, in the entire United States, there are probably no more than 10 or 15 scholars who are really acquainted with the political history of Burma in detail. 10 or 15, right? Scholars in the entire country. Burma is a country that is truly multi-ethnic. Over 1/3 of the population of Burma comprises of minority ethnic groups. The majority group is called the Bamar. Okay, the word Burma and Bamar are related. That's the majority group, the Bamar. And the leadership in the military is drawn almost entirely from the ranks of the Bamar. So one thing we have to understand, I'm going to complicate this even a bit more, but one thing we have to understand is that the resistance movement in Burma really is twofold, overtly. And then within that, one could segment it into many different, but one is obviously a resistance to military rule, to state authoritarianism. But it is also the resistance of minority ethnic groups to the dominant ethnic group. Right? So when countries intervene, if they seek to intervene, they don't always understand how things are playing out within Burma itself. And what is very interesting, and this is a problem, by the way, this is another aside, it's an enormously interesting, complicated problem all over the world, is that in many countries, it is these minority ethnic groups who live in areas which are the richest in natural resources. The richest in natural resources. So, I mean, a similar kind of thing would be, for example, large tracts of land in the US, which are, quote, in the first people in the American Indian reservations, or let's take Alaska, which ethnic population, of course, is originally different, right? Now, you find the same thing in India, where you have large number of tribal communities, and these tribal communities largely live in states which are rich, spectacularly rich in deposits. It could be coal, it could be iron, it could be semi-precious stones, any number of things. And the same thing is happening actually in Burma. So you see, it is also a war over economic resources of a different kind that is part of the picture that we have to think about over here. And then finally, and this is really something that I think all of you will immediately resonate to, although not everyone may have thought of it. See, while I'm, of course, entirely sympathetic to the pro-democracy movement, it is very interesting to my mind that the same people who are taking part in this movement now did not utter a word of protest when the Rohingya were thrown out of Burma. There was an ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya, who are Muslims, right? And in fact, I think the whole world was quite partly for that reason. Yes, there was a customary hue and cry. You have to have that customary hue and cry, people shedding, as to use that euphemism, crocodile tears. Nobody really cared, frankly, if you ask me. Nobody really cared. And the same protesters who are today recoiling against military rule, many of these people partook in the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya, who were expelled, thrown out, driven out, and turned into refugees. And we're not talking about a handful of people, we're talking about over 750,000. And the ones who stay behind in Burma are still staying behind in an extremely perilous state. So where were the democratic sentiments of all of these people then? It's worthwhile asking. And this is to suggest partly that there are never any true unadulterated heroes in any movement of resistance. It's always a complicated story. This is not to put them down, it's to suggest that this is in fact the nature of politics, that we very often agitate for our own vested interests. Right? Now, section 3, I come to the United States. The events of January 6th. I'm not going to discuss the events as such, because I think all of you know them. And huge amounts has been written on the events of January 6th, and of course continues to be written. We know that the House just recently has approved, after much negotiation, a commission to investigate this, right? I will have some things to say about the so-called Republican Party. In my view, it's not a party. It's actually a cabal of the mafia and mobsters and criminals. There is actually one party in the United States today. And so we have an old problem here, which is the US has been a one-party state for as long as it's been in existence. Because as Paul Goodman, a very acerbic commentator, reminded us in the 1960s, the only point of American elections back then, he wrote, was to help Americans distinguish between indistinguishable Republicans and Democrats. All right. And now I know that all of you are part of TV Democrats and you're going to say, no, no, no. But we can discuss this at substantial length. And of course, the American civil rights, the leaders of the civil rights movement knew that very well. They didn't distinguish between Republicans and Democrats. And you'll have to ask yourself why. Just look at the speeches of Martin Luther King, Bayard Rustin, James Farmer, James Lawson. Right? I'll give you 50 names in the movement and tell me how often they distinguished between Republicans and Democrats. They did not, because they understood the colossal insignificance of that distinction for them. So we'll have to understand for whom that distinction is important and for whom it's not. Right? So now when we speak of the events of January 6th, I don't think that things like commission and any of that, those kinds of things tell us anything at all about what is really at stake here in the events of January 6th. And here I'm not referring even really to an actual interpretation of the events. For example, was there complicity on the part of the US Capitol Police or other American agencies? Why did it take so long to send troops in to restore order? I mean, I was watching and I'm wondering, why is it taking them 4 hours? And of course there is complicity. There's no question in my mind that there is complicity on the part of the agencies of the United States government in permitting this to happen. This was a permissive attack, right? You don't have to believe in conspiracy theories. I don't believe at all in conspiracy theories. I simply look at what's transpiring and understand that in the context not only of what happened then, but how is it that politics is conducted in many parts of the world and in the United States historically, and how do things actually happen? Right? So I'm not referring just to that. Those are I think vital points, because if indeed that's the case, then that tells us that something is rotten in the state of the United States. Right? If something of that scale happens as a permissive event. Right? And of course, there are considerations such as the fact, I mean, I'm not the first person to point it out. Many people wondered that, hey, had this been a vast majority of Black people coming into the US Capitol, would they have been allowed to do this for 4 hours? How many of them would have been shot dead instantly, right? Et cetera, et cetera. We have heard these arguments before, right? What I'm interested in is something deeper here, right? Because I want to suggest to you, and this is, I know, not something that is easily acceptable, and some of you will doubtless disagree, which I think you should, because these are obviously, there are great stakes here, and it all happens to be a matter of how one interprets history. And I do it from the standpoint, this is something I insist on in all my work, and I make this point to my colleagues as well. And I don't mean just my colleagues in my department, I mean colleagues across the world. That is, fellow scholars, whether they're historians or anthropologists, because even though I teach in a history department, I don't see myself only as a historian. In fact, I don't have a single degree in history. I have a doctorate for sure, but I don't have a single degree, not even a bachelor's degree in history. So what is that point? Which is that it is, in my view, impossible to understand your own civilization unless you know another civilization which is vastly different equally well. So if you really want to understand your own history, I think you have to go and really understand the history of some other civilization that is profoundly different in some ways. It could be China, it could be Japan, it could be Africa, it could be India. And the same holds true for someone who is an Indian who wants to understand India. You have to know the West. So that's what I've labored to do. And my earlier work is all in Western civilization, not in India. Now, my own view of the matter is that what is at stake in the events of January 6th are two things. We could multiply the two. That we could, of course, if I was doing a full-scale analysis only of that over several hours, then I would say what's at stake are a great many more things. But here I want to really look only at two. One is the history of American exceptionalism. And the second is the still unacknowledged history of genocide. In my view, what happened is not an anomaly at all. What has only transpired here is that it has come deep inside the US Capitol itself. A certain form of violence that I think is endemic to the United States. And there are different manifestations of it, many different manifestations of it. US power is one. The nature of gun violence, which is really bizarre. The US is the only country in the world that has that history. And I have students in two classes right now. We're discussing some of these matters, and they think it's simply a matter of lax laws about guns and all of that. No, I think the problem is deeply seated. It's not simply a matter of tinkering with the law, gun background checks, this and that. They've been talking about it since the day I arrived in the United States. I remember that. I arrived here as an immigrant in 1976. Right? And for 45 years, I've been hearing exactly the same discussions about background checks and this and that. That's all nonsense, complete humbug. And there, the Republicans and Democrats have both failed absolutely miserably. Because there are countries which have the same spirit of, quote, Yankee individualism, which do not have a problem with gun violence, as the US does. Because some of my students say, well, it's a traditions of individualism. Yes, I agree that there is a deep, profound suspicion of the state in the US. And to some extent, I think we should be suspicious of the state. You'd be surprised for me to hear me say perhaps that only in this way do I have some residual agreement with Republicans in a certain way that there is a suspicion of the state. A hermeneutics of suspicion is very important because we have to understand historically how the state has operated all over the world and what have been the implications of state power. I think that there is a suspicion. I think Democrats, some of them, are not sufficiently aware of this, in my view, the necessity for the suspicion of a state. Okay, but that's almost like an aside here for the moment, because it is traditions of individualism which have certainly been important in the US, but traditions of individualism have been very important in the United Kingdom, in Great Britain, and Australia. How have those countries resolved the problems of guns? They have. You just have to look at the statistics. Not to mention countries such as Japan, but I don't raise an example of Japan because people will tell you here, oh, it's a conformist society. Japan, with a population that is 1/3 the population of the United States, had 11 deaths from homicide on the average each of the last 10 years. 11, 1, 1. The United States had 30,000. 30,000. You don't need a civil war in this country of the kind that you have in other countries. You already have more deaths taking place from guns, you know, right? And of course, if you multiply 11 by 3, so then you get population proportionately the same as the US, so it's 33. That's not going to account for the difference. One student of mine said, oh, the reason why there are more deaths in the US is because it has a population that's much larger than Japan. I said, well, I think you should do some simple arithmetic, here, okay? And learn what proportion and ratio means. So let's understand that there are issues like that. But what I'm speaking about is American exceptionalism. You see, there is a history in this country which goes back to the Puritans and the Pilgrims. Not identical groups, but we don't need to worry about that at the moment, but both groups are implicated in this history. And that is a history that America had a special place in the eyes of God right from the beginning. America was going to be the city on the hill. It was going to be the city on the hill. Some people think that the phrase was invented by Ronald Reagan. It wasn't invented by him. It was used by the Puritans throughout the 1600s in their writings, okay? So this idea that America has some special, is taken care of. There's a special dispensation which provides for this country. And I have to say that every American president has been complicit in that idea. Every single president without exception. In fact, most spectacularly, Barack Obama in many ways. But we'll get to Mr. Obama in just a few moments. Right? So and this exceptionalism has spawned all kinds of things. It spawned a kind of exceptionalism in every sphere of life. Every sphere of life. Whether it's sports, the fact that Americans do not have a sport which can end in a draw. You have to have a winner or a loser. And of course, metaphorically, it means that Americans cannot live with ambiguity at all. They like black or white. That's what they like. As Mr. Bush said, speaking of Osama bin Laden and the war against not the Taliban at that time, but Al-Qaeda, right? You're either with us or against us. Well, why should be one either with you or against you? What if both of you are wrong? What if the Al-Qaeda is a terrorist group? And what if you, Mr. Bush, are a war criminal? Which was a position that some people would take, right? So, but the point is, whether one agrees with that or not, it is this thing, with us or against us. So what happens in American sports? You play basketball, right? Regulation time, 48 minutes, the game is tied. What happens? It cannot end in a tie. It must go into overtime. And if it doesn't conclude in overtime with a decisive result, it must go into second overtime, a third overtime. American sports are predicated on that. Look at the culture of cricket in England, where you can have a test match for 5 days. 5 days. Can you imagine any American playing a sport that lasted over 5 days? Right? I mean, a culture where speed is everything, where I have 20-year-old students who are impatient with me because they want to become millionaires overnight. Right? And they write a book where they barely know how to write English, and they send the book to me and say, Professor Lal, would you review the book? I mean, you must be out of your mind, I think to myself. But they want to know, they want celebrity instantly. This is the instant culture. Right? Now in cricket, you play for 5 days, and at the end of that, you can have a draw. We have to understand what are the implications of that culture. You see, that metaphor means something for that civilization. So this American exceptionalism runs in everything. And part of that exceptionalism also is absolute refusal to recognize that genocide is inextricably part of the history of this country. Inextricably a part of the history of this country. And if we do not recognize that, it will be impossible for the United States to be a force for good in the long run. All right? I can dwell on all of these points at much, much greater length. Fourth thing, fourth section, the rise of India. I consider it my particular misfortune that the two countries that I'm most closely associated with, India, the land of my birth, and where I have lived the longest besides the United States, and where I still retain a home, and where I have family, and where I spend 3 to 4 months every year, and sometimes entire years over there. That the two countries that I think today present the worst spectacles of a democracy are India and the US in many respects. Right? Now, in India, the rise of the BJP is the Bharatiya Janata Party. It's a Hindu nationalist party. It's led by a man, you all know of him, Narendra Modi. He's very often compared to Donald Trump. You would have seen endless number of articles comparing the two now. The strong man. You know, these are called, it's a culture of the strong man, as it's called. All of that is true. However, let us consider for a second how Modi came to where he is today. And here I'm not going to give you the full picture. I'm going to give you only one aspect of that picture, which is his international image. So I don't know how many of you are aware that Mr. Modi was banned from the United States, officially banned from the United States. In 2002, he was a chief minister of the state of Gujarat, with the state that he comes from. And in 2002, in early 2002, in February, there was a pogrom in Gujarat against the Muslims. This pogrom took place under his watch, and there is overwhelming evidence that it didn't simply take place under his watch, it took place with his full knowledge, and indeed, I would go so far as to say, with his approval, if not his authorization. That may be a bit difficult, but certainly with his approval. And that he had given a green light to the mobsters, the rioters, the murderers, it seems to me. Now, this was, quote, never officially proved in India. Long history, I can't get into that. But what is really important here is that the view that he was complicit was a view that came to have considerable international acceptance. To the extent that when Mr. Modi decided that he would come to India, to the United States, he already had a visitor's visa. That visa was revoked by the State Department. And there was a law that was passed. And to the best of my knowledge, things may have changed in very recent years. To the best of my knowledge, for several years, the only foreign politician against whom that law was actually applied, that particular law, was Mr. Modi. And that law was that somebody acting either as a head of state or as a very important political figure, which is what he was. He was not the head of state because he was only the chief minister of a state, but he was not the prime minister of India at that time. That somebody acting in a capacity of that kind against whom there were serious human rights violations allegations by a large number of international organizations would not be permitted to enter the US. And so Mr. Modi was kept out. He tried repeatedly to come here, repeatedly, and failed. In 2014, he gets elected as Prime Minister of India when his party swept the polls. Who do you suppose was the President of the United States at that time? Barack Obama. And I can tell you, I can cite chapter and verse to you, if I had to, that the person who is most responsible anywhere in the world for rehabilitating Modi internationally is Barack Obama. He welcomes him to the White House with open arms. He goes to India. He goes to India as the chief guest of Narendra Modi on January 26th, which is the most important day other than Independence Day. This is the Republic Day of India, where they have this huge parade and there's usually a chief guest, and Barack Obama accepted. In fact, Obama and Modi were very close to each other to the extent that Steve Ratner, a very close advisor of Barack Obama, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in June of 2019. The op-ed piece is Why Narendra Modi is Good for India. All right? This man, Mr. Obama, is singularly responsible, more than anyone else, for rehabilitating Narendra Modi in the international image. Now, India was always held up for lots of reasons. There's a historical reason for that, partly because India was a country that had obviously set the model for the rest of the world. Mohandas Gandhi had orchestrated the independence of India. He was the chief architect of Indian independence, widely respected, of course. And then, of course, in the 1960s, all over the world, in the 1960s, of course, you had, the civil rights movements, well, 50s and 60s, beginning with the Montgomery bus boycott and all the way till the assassination of Martin Luther King. Gandhi remained a personal figure for every civil rights leader, a person that they really wanted to emulate. All right, long history there, but simply to give you an idea of the fact that India was held in a different light. But this was not the only reason. I mean, the Indian National Congress became the model organization for countries in Africa. The African National Congress, the Kenyan National Congress, all modeled themselves after the Indian National Congress. India was also seen, from the vantage point of someone like myself coming from India, from a country that had been colonized, the principal thing in the second half of the 20th century was not the Cold War. The principal thing was decolonization. And India led the world in decolonization in many fundamental respects. And it offered a big contrast to Pakistan, which came under military rule from 1958 to 71, from 1977 to 88, from 1999 to 2008. For half of its existence, at least, Pakistan was under military rule. India seemed to offer a very different example. Now, the road to Hindu nationalism is a long road, but let me take 5 minutes because I then want to move to the concluding section, right? And of course, as a scholar of India, I've written voluminously and lectured voluminously about developments in India and the rise of nationalism, so I can give you enormous detail over there. But in what respects has India become a catastrophic failure today? It's not simply what is happening with the coronavirus pandemic. I think Anne pointed out, that India is now in the news for the way it used to be in the news, by the way. In the 1970s and 80s, the only time ever India was in the news was something like the Bhopal gas leak. So when I was living in the US, I shuddered to see India in the news because I figured if I'm going to see India in the news, it's probably some disaster or catastrophe that has unfolded there, right? So assassination of Mrs. Gandhi, the Bhopal gas leak, things of that kind, right? So when I say it's a catastrophic failure, what do I mean by that? Well, for one thing, and let me add this caveat, I do not mean to imply that all of this started only with the rise of the BJP. Some of these developments have been in the making for a number of decades. Some commentator like Arundhati Roy, who in my view is not very useful for understanding these things, because she will simply say, well, India never had a democracy. It was always fascist anyhow. I mean, the minute we go down that road, there's no country that has had ever any democracy, even for a moment. Every country is fascist. Because, of course, if the US is fascist and India is fascist, then you tell me what's not fascist. Well, maybe Sweden and Finland and New Zealand, whose charming young prime minister is the model for everyone for all the wrong reasons, but let's leave that aside for the moment, right? I mean, what country is not fascist? So what does fascism really mean? Because certainly Iraq is fascist, Afghanistan is, Sudan is, Congo is, right? They're all under either dictatorships, they've massacred or killed hundreds of thousands of people. So what are we going to do with that? The category has no analytical purchase. And that's why you've noted I have not used that word, fascism, because as a scholar, I understand its implications and I know its histories and I can think about its futures. Right? So my submission to you would be, I'm not at all painting a rosy picture, not even remotely. You can see that of India. But what I'm saying is that there are developments which go back several decades. I don't think they go back to 1947 necessarily, the time of independence. But some developments that I'm speaking of now have been in the making for at least 2-3 decades. And that includes the time when the Congress was the ruling party. That is the party that is now, it doesn't make any sense to call it the principal opposition because there is no principal opposition. That's part of the problem of Indian politics today, that at the national level, we don't have a national level opposition. We have regional parties that are exceedingly important. But whether at the time of the national election or what are called the Lok Sabha elections, Lok Sabha is the Indian House, the lower house of the Indian Parliament, equivalent of the House of Representatives, whether at that time a national opposition can come up is something that is difficult to speculate. Right now, the prospects for that are virtually zero at this point in time, right? So bearing in mind what I'm saying, that some of these developments have been going on for 2-3 decades, what are the developments I'm referring to? Very briefly, the fact that all our institutions have been gutted. India has an election commission, which was a very respectable body. It has proved to be now nothing more than a handmaiden to the Modi government, unfortunately. The recent legislative assembly elections in a state called West Bengal show that very clearly, where election rallies, and this is related to the coronavirus pandemic explosion, where rallies were held by the BJP, where 50,000, 150,000 people showed up maskless. Election Commission did nothing. Not only that, it actually staggered the election, unprecedented in the history of India, for a state legislative assembly election. It staggered it into 8 phases. So the election for the legislative assembly of the state of West Bengal was held over a period of 5.5 weeks, during which the pandemic, of course, spread like crazy. Why did it do it for 5.5 weeks? Because the party is flush with money. If they can drag out the election, they can have more rallies. Right? I mean, lots of reasons, but the Election Commission completely abnegated its duties. That's what I mean when I say the institutions have been gutted. The best universities have been destroyed because in India, as in most countries, universities are a source of dissent. Where is the dissent going to come from if it's not going to come from, among other places, universities? So the best public universities in our country have been gutted. The Supreme Court has also abdicated responsibilities. The only silver lining here is that the Indian high courts have stepped in the last several months in very interesting ways. And in fact, it was the Madras High Court, right? So Madras is, some of you may know it only by its modern name of Chennai. The old name is Madras. So a huge city, of course, in South India, right? In Madras, the High Court there actually said that what the Election Commission had done was murder. That's not my word. That's the word they used, murder. Referring to the fact that the Election Commission did almost nothing with regard to saying, no, you can't have these rallies because there's a pandemic going on, right? Right? So all of these institutions have been gutted. Human rights activists across the board, including friends of mine, have been put under arrest. Ironically,
And virtually all of them are nonviolent activists. And ironically, this government, which claims to be restoring India to its glory, is using colonial era legislation. One of the charges that they have imposed upon many of these human rights activists is the charge of sedition. This goes back to the Indian Penal Code, section 144, which defines sedition. And this penal code goes back to the colonial period when the British framed the laws for India. In Britain itself, they got rid of the sedition law. The British got rid of the sedition law in India. They didn't get rid of the sedition in Britain. They didn't get rid of it in India while they were ruling India for obvious reasons. It was a colonial power ruling over a subject people. And the state, Indian state, a free republic of India retained this legislation and is now using it against its own citizens. All right, and the last point here, just to give you a sense, I also want to bring in the pandemic here in a different way now. And then I move to the last section. When I speak about how India has been gutted of its institutions and all of that, everyone is speaking about the collapse of the healthcare system. But no one is really pausing to ask, why has it collapsed? It has collapsed not simply because of the inefficiency and corruption in the system. It has collapsed because India gave up on the idea of public health care. It is the privatization of the medical system over the course of the last several decades, which has been greatly aggravated by the present administration, that is responsible to a great extent for what's happening in India today. And I think you know that one of the reasons I'm mentioning that is that this is one problem in the US as well, that its investment in public health infrastructure is very weak in comparison to countries such as the Scandinavian countries. And of course, a country you dare not mention here in this country because you'll be immediately called a communist, Cuba. We should see why Cuba has dealt so spectacularly well with the coronavirus pandemic. Everybody talks about New Zealand. Talk about Cuba, which has been under a continuous assault from the US, which is under a sanctions regime which is draconian, and it has handled the pandemic spectacularly well. I can give you, again, enormous data about that. I have a chapter on that in my book, which was published last year, which Anne referred to, The Fury of COVID-19, right? And I'm not saying this as someone who's a communist or anything of that kind, because if I had the time, obviously, the reason I'm not talking about China is because China is never a democracy to begin with. So we're really looking at countries that in some sense have at least either are established democracies or have flirted with democracy, as in the case of Burma, or countries such as India, which fall somewhere in between, right? But China is a totalitarian state, right? So there, the set of considerations is very different. And that brings me then finally to the last section. And that is that, so is it all doom and gloom? How do we really think about the prospects, the perils, the promise of democracy? And I want to make 7 points here. The first is that I think we should recognize very clearly the limitations of electoral democracy. Electoral democracy was a fabulous system compared to all others. Those old sayings by wise statesmen that if there was a better system, I would adopt it. Right? It's a bad system, but it's the best of all the bad systems. We've all heard this in some form or the other, right? I think we'll have to go well beyond that, because the problem with electoral democracy is not simply one of representation. I mean, remember that you've got the same number of seats in the House today as you've had for decades. The population in the US has grown. Look at India. You have a population of 1.32 billion, 1.35 billion. How many people are elected to the Lok Sabha? Only 100 more. To the House, that is the equivalent of the House of Representatives. Only 100 more than in the United States. Right? to represent 500 some odd people to represent a country of 1.4 billion or 1.35 billion, right? But it's not just that. The problem is our democracies have become only electoral democracies today. See, you don't, before an election is even finished, you start planning for the next one. It is not an accident that Mr. Trump, when he won the last election, that very same day he formed a political action committee to get reelected for the next election. That is what they do in all electoral democracies. And here I'm not even speaking about the enormous corruption that is involved and the amount of money which is obscene and which the Supreme Court, frankly, of the United States has said is fine. I mean, if you know what I'm referring to, the Citizens United, case, right? Practically no restraints. Secondly, a very different point. See, I think ethical considerations have disappeared from politics altogether. They have disappeared altogether. This is partly a problem of political culture now. The problem is not unique to the US. What do I mean by that? I will give you one simple illustration. Let us look at the word shame. Shame. Right? See, there's this idea that we feel ashamed when we do something. Right? If, for example, I'm having a Zoom meeting right now here, and I was having, sex and had forgotten to shut off my video, which has happened. That's why I take the example, not happened with me, thankfully. It has happened with a very famous New Yorker journalist. Some of you may know what I'm referring to, right? And he thought his video was off, and well, it wasn't, right? Now, does the person actually feel shame? My submission to you is no, not any longer. Why? Because that idea of shame is no longer part of our working political vocabulary. See, many Democrats would like to think, well, this is, the Republican problem. For example, look at Donald Trump. See, everybody's talking about the fact that democracy has been revived because he got defeated. Well, the first question to ask is, how did he get elected in the first place? Given that you have a man who is a serial sexual assaulter, with at least 15 complaints out in the open, I'm sure there are another 150 that have not come out in the open. How did this man get elected in the first place? Because he has no shame, and all the ones who support him have no shame either. And if you think this is only a problem of Mr. Trump, let me remind you of Mr. Anthony Weiner. No puns intended, right? Mr. Weiner, right? 19, who you might remember, he served 7 terms as a congressman from New York as a Democrat. In no one election out of those 7 did he ever receive. And you know what happened to him, right? He was caught sexting, or whatever the term is, sending tweets out about, sexual affairs, underage girls, whatever it is, right? And guess what? So he resigns, and then guess what? 2 years later, he runs for the New York mayor's race. Where did his shame go? It didn't go anywhere because he didn't have any. And that's the problem. This is an illustration. This is not the entirety of what I mean when I talk about the absence of ethics in politics. Similar stories in India, galore. All right. So that's the second aspect we have to think about. Number 3, an argument that I know that many of you will have reason to quarrel with, but I have to make it because this is what my position is. And I say this as someone who is, quote, a minority. Okay, a religious minority, a racial minority. And since you can't tell from my hair, but I'm also a height minority. For a male, I'm so short that I'm almost invisible. Okay, I can give you a stand-up comic show on that one of these days. Because when I came to this country, Randy Newman had a song, "Short People Got No Reason to Live." you know. So I got an interesting take on that. But the argument I want to make over here is simply this, that identity politics had its place, but today it has actually completely evacuated politics of all meaning. I think, in fact, it is something that all people who claim to be minorities for one reason or another, whether because they are, you know, Asian, Chicano, Black, or whether because they're Hindu or a Muslim, so a religious minority, or because their sexual orientation is, you know, LGBTQX, whatever, plus, right? You know, they keep on adding, right? Whatever it is, right? That, you see, politics in this country has now been reduced to the politics of identity. And Kamala Harris's ascendancy has everything to do with that. The woman of color, the first woman of color to, you know, first Black woman to represent, not the first Black woman in the U.S. Senate. There was Carol Moseley Brown, but the first person from California. You know, she has a number of firsts. The first, of course, woman of color to be, you know, vice president, first woman who was both half African, half Indian, et cetera, all of that. All right. But I'd like to ask, what is our politics vis-a-vis Africa, for example? Right? What was Mr. Obama's politics vis-a-vis Africa? What did Mr. Obama ever do anything that was actually beneficial for Africa? I really want to know. I don't think he did anything that was beneficial to Africa. Of course, somebody could say that, yeah, it gave Africans a lot of pride to see a Black man there, but I'm talking about substantive difference here, right? We could make many kinds of arguments of this sort, but I want to try to explain to you what, in my view, has been happening in American politics. See, in America, they have understood very well that you can make certain kinds of accommodations without giving up on the system. So let's look as an illustration. I've given you the illustration actually of Mr. Obama. I've also pointed to, for example, his place in the rehabilitation of Modi. Look at his politics vis-a-vis Africa, for example, I would say. But let's take an example of the following kind. Let's take a look at the US Army. See, what was 200 years ago, a Black man could not fight in the US Army. Now, in the Civil War, Black soldiers did fight on the side of the Union. Okay? And if you go down into the Deep South, there are even a few memorials to Black soldiers who fought in the Civil War. Right? But for many years thereafter, the units, the regiments in which Black people served were completely segregated. They only served in segregated units. So what was the piecemeal reform eventually? Eventually, it was integration. Remove the segregation from the army. Then what happened? Then what happened was they said, okay, we'll make another accommodation. Now we'll make an accommodation to gay people. You know that gay people couldn't serve in the US Army, right? And eventually they said, we'll do that. Then what happened? Women could serve, but not in combat roles. Now women can serve in combat roles. See, they'll keep on making these little accommodations. That's how it works. The question, of course, is where is the structural critique of the US Army here? Okay? The question is, who gives up on capitalism? Who says, I'm going to actually have to critique capitalism? Right? This is what I mean, that there is a way in which politics has been framed as essentially as an identity politics. Okay, I see a little chat here from Anne here about leaving time for Q&A, so I'll just wrap up in 2 minutes. So fourth point, I've sort of talked about it, American exceptionalism, American genocide. I think we'll have to really come to an awareness of that. I had a long comment on that. I'll leave it. And fifth point had to do with looking at the US and India and looking at how both of these countries have curiously become, again, one-party states. Because as I've said to you, I don't consider the Republican Party a political party, actually. I consider it a cabal of mobsters and criminals, and that's my view. And it's a cabal that is full of the stench of white supremacy. If somebody tells me Mitch Connell is married to an Asian American woman, therefore that shows, then I'd say that, well, they frankly are naive beyond belief. Okay, simply because he's married to Elaine Chao, you know, doesn't demonstrate anything at all about whether white supremacy is critical to the Republican Party or not. And I'm saying it is a very lifeblood of the Republican Party. Right? So I don't consider that a legitimate political party. I think it should be declared, actually the party should be declared a terrorist organization. You know, that's my view of the matter. Sixth, I think in democracies, we need to learn, even an established democracy needs to learn from other parts of the world. Africa, which I've mentioned, provides two good examples. One is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. I am by no means saying that it was spectacular success. And I know what's happening in South Africa now. I know some of the troubles the country is going through. But nevertheless, it showed a way for how one deals with crimes of an enormous magnitude, how one deals with questions of the past. And the second example comes actually from Rwanda, where there was a ferocious genocide in 1994. And in this genocide, 800,000 Tutsis were killed by the Hutus. And what is very interesting is that in Rwanda, they did an experiment. And that experiment was that they released, after many of these Hutus murderers, they released them into the general public in an amnesty, where these same people went back to their villages and lived among the very people whose family members they had butchered and killed. Because it was a way for people to now say, well, we have to reckon with it. It's also a way for people to understand that those who are victimized themselves can turn into killers. This is one of the things that we learn in history. It's a problem of Nazi Germany, because the problem is not 1,000 people at the top. The problem is, how did so many millions of Germans become complicit? Right? And that's where we learned that the line between the victim and the killer is often very thin. That people who are victims can be turned into killers very quickly. Ordinary people. And lastly, I think, seventhly, it is the protests on the street today which suggest some kind of possibility for the rejuvenation of democracies and societies. There is a pro-democracy movement in Burma because the coup took place, and what is really remarkable is within 24 hours, the people were out there on the streets. In fact, they instigated a general strike which virtually paralyzed the country, There's India, many people have referred to the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, which of course that China has now completely suppressed almost, but which was very much in the news a couple of years ago, right? But you know, Hong Kong is a country that scores very high on so many indices, literacy, development. That's why Burma is a more interesting example, because it doesn't score high, and yet they have a very vibrant pro-democracy movement. Of course, India provides a second spectacular example, because you had what is called the Shaheen Bagh movement. This is Muslim women who really waged an extraordinary demonstration, which then captured the imagination of the country against the Modi regime. This is before the coronavirus pandemic. This is in opposition to what was called the Citizenship Amendment Act, you know, and then more recently, what is called the farmers' movement in India. So I think that these movements, I had a lot more to say on that, but I'll stop over here to take any questions that anyone has. It is these movements which I suggest really point to ways that will eventually energize what is called the democratic polity. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinay Law. Thank you very much. So we do have a few questions, and we also have some other business to take care of. So we had a couple that came early, but I wanted to talk to the ones that came during the meeting. Carol had a question about when you talked about India. Did they have the same sustain for masking that the Republicans have in this country? Is that also exasperating their COVID response?
Yeah, well, so, the answer to that is that no, actually, you see that there wasn't initially, I mean, masking has been taken quite seriously in many parts of India, and certainly in the first part. When I say the first part, or I should say the first phase of the pandemic, before the so-called second wave, it was actually quite widely observed. I mean, they imposed penalties as well on that. But again, as is the case in every country, because we have to remember that, there have been anti-masking protests, not just in the United States, but in Germany, in Denmark, in many countries, right? And that's partly because there is some tradition of individualism. There is that suspicion of the state, right? There's also what many people viewed as conflicting scientific evidence, which was certainly the case in the first part. We were hearing quite contradictory things about this. But the brief answer would be, I don't think that is the main contributor, that there have been certainly people who haven't been masking, but I don't think that has been an issue in the way it has been in the US. And I certainly cannot think of anything comparable to the militias that came out in Michigan, for example, here in the US, protesting against masking, as though this was, the most fundamental problem for them in the world, that somehow they were being constrained. I think that's absurd, actually, Yeah.
Okay. There was also a question earlier, and you spoke a little bit about it in terms of celebrity worship, or, people like in Modi, and here we have Trump. Do you think celebrity worship contributes to authoritarianism?
Oh, yeah. In general, yes. In general, yes. But this is the celebrity culture is a much larger problem. I mean, it's like, influencer. Who are these people, right? I mean, someone who's a 20-year-old. I mean, I'm astonished at the immaturity of modern civilization. Some 20-year-old, a little dim-witted person, frankly, who's somehow acquires 50,000 followers on Instagram and then has a cheek to write to a 5-star hotel and say, give me a week's stay at your hotel free, and I'll write something on my Instagram blog because I've got 50,000 followers, and the hotel will do it. I mean, what kind of culture are we living in, right? So I think that one has to have, pardon the expression, one has to have a healthy dose of contempt for many such modern phenomena, such as influencers, right? Because who are these influencers? What are they doing? What good have they done? Have they ever actually given any serious thought, right? Because I would submit to you, thinking is a very difficult, demanding human process, right?
So speaking of influencers, which I feel we have here in the United States, is someone else had a question. Do you think there are different reasons in other countries in terms of this common thread of desiring more authoritarian governments? Do they also have a different type of influencer, or how would you compare what we're doing?
Right. So the worldwide trend towards authoritarianism, of course, I mean, so there are two different, so we can't really blame, quote, influencers, but we can talk about two aspects of it in answer to the question. One is, let's say, the influence of the US here. If the US is receptive to a strong man, does that encourage strong men in other countries? That is usually the default reading that most political commentators have. I don't quite agree with that. I think there is an element of that, but in many cultures, in many countries, Modi came to power before Trump did. Let's not forget that. Okay, in the Philippines has had a dictator almost before Trump came to power. Okay, right? And if you're looking at Hungary, the political dispensation there was shaped by Orban, who coined the phrase. In the year 2010, he explicitly stated that his idea was to showcase Hungary as an example of, quote, an illiberal democracy. For him, this is not an oxymoron. Illiberal democracy. That is before Trump comes to power. So you have a tradition of strongmen in many parts of the world. I think, nonetheless, it is unquestionably the case that when the US itself has a strong man, as was the case with Trump, it certainly is a green light to other people as well. But I don't think it's like they have to wait for the US or take their inspiration. If anything, the US probably is emulating other countries, if I may say so, in this respect, right? Yeah.
Okay. I have a question here from Jim McClellan, but I think you should ask it because I'm not quite clear your question. Are you still on?
Yes, my question was about the rehabilitation that I've noticed of Subhash Chandra Bose, who was a charismatic leader of the, a branch of the Congress Party, and led the pro-Japanese military effort to try to liberate India. And I was just wondering whether you had any thoughts. Had you noticed that he had been gradually rehabilitated?
Okay. Oh, yes, I have a lot of thoughts on that. The first is that I don't necessarily agree with the proposition that he has been rehabilitated only recently. Let us remember, so there are many here in the audience who I suspect don't know the figure we're talking about. With Subhash Chandra Bose, who was a contemporary of Gandhi and Nehru, who took a very different view, even though he was a member of the Congress. He took a very different view on the means and ends issue with respect to how to attain independence. So he sided with the fascists, to put it very simply, right? So he goes over to the Nazis. He also founds an army called the Indian National Army, which conducted a war to a very limited extent against the British. Now, it is the case that in Bengal, there has never been any need to rehabilitate him because he has always been viewed as a great national hero. All right. The question you're really asking is this. I would use a different word, not rehabilitation, because rehabilitation requires that he fell into disrepute, which is not really the case. There have always been those people who disagreed with Gandhi and who sided with Subhash Bose. The word that, if I may say so, permit me, that you're really looking for is, has the present government exploited his name to their advantage? There, the answer is unequivocally yes. They have. To what end, with what success, that will take very long to answer. I could give you a very, very long answer to that. The short answer is, I don't believe that they have been spectacularly successful, because they have tried to, in that sense, exploit the name of every nationalist, even those whose views are antithetical to theirs and who would have despised what the present government stands for, you see, right? Such as, for example, Bhimrao Ambedkar, the great leader of the Dalits. Mr. Modi has gone and paid his respects to Ambedkar. I think Ambedkar would have dismissed Modi as a completely fraudulent figure, you see? So that would be the way to answer that.
Okay, there's another question here from Liz. Do you want to ask your question? You just came in with it. Or do you want me to?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay. So I grew up in Africa. And so for me, when I look at the failure of democracies around the world, electoral democracies, one of the questions I wonder is whether this is partly because they were introduced and established in a lot of places by colonial powers, who had very little regard for the people who lived there and therefore for the social and political dynamics of the people who lived there. And so you put in these systems expecting them to work, where they worked in Europe and they worked in America, partly because they were geared towards a very homogeneous population of white men. But in those cultures, you've got countries like Kenya with 42 tribes and then sub-tribes underneath that. And it's very hard to even come up with a majority or even a functional government in such fractious countries. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, everything you've said is absolutely correct. I can only elaborate on this and an additional complexion on what you're saying. I agree with what you said. Let me put it in more analytical terms. The first fundamental problem, it's a problem for all of us, no matter where we are. But it's a problem particularly acute in Africa. And that is the problem of the nation state. See, the world is divided into nation states. Nation state is a certain way of imagining a political community. But a nation state is in fact a 17th century European invention that came out of the Treaty of Westphalia. What a nation state does is it homogenizes its population. You cannot have a nation state without process of homogenization. In Africa, this has been an absolute disaster. It has been a disaster for reasons you pointed out. There is an enormous complexity in that part of the world. And the way Africa was carved up into nation states was entirely of the making of the white man, entirely, 100%. It goes back to the Berlin Conference, where the European powers came, sat down and said, this is how we're going to carve up Africa. And you see, it makes absolutely zero sense. A lot of these groups, for example, are nomadic groups, pastoralists. They don't know what a nation state boundary is. You're in here and you cross over, now you're in a different country, actually. Right? You've transgressed the borders. You can be arrested, as it were. If you look at Rwanda, where did Rwanda, modern day Rwanda, come out of? What is its relationship to the Congo and to Burundi, for example? Right? So the first point of analysis here would be this fiction, which became the universal truth, that as human beings, we are all going to simply live in something called a nation state. And to me, of course, you cannot begin to resolve the problem of modern day politics without addressing the whole question of the nation state. So what you have said is something I entirely agree with. I've just added a different complexion to it. And of course, I could add a great many more to this point, but the point is very well taken.
Okay, we are running out of time. I do see a hand up. I'm not sure if you meant to have it up, Mehran. You're not looking at your cameras.
Yeah, I had a question, but it's up to you. Do you have time?
Yeah, we'll allow one more question and then we'll move on.
Yeah, so, I mean, you have some examples like India that are religiously authoritarian, and Erdogan of Turkey is one example, rolling back a lot of the reforms in what was a model Islamic state, transforming, becoming democracy. But there are other countries that don't necessarily fit the model of an authoritarian. For example, in the Brexit, which happened before Trump, and you had Boris Johnson. I mean, he is not really an authoritarian, but he is still a populist right-wing leader. And you see, some of them are authoritarian in Europe, but some of them are not. But basically, a lot of these right-wing populist movements have beaten back center-left parties inside Europe. And I was wondering, is it just social media spreading conspiracy theories, and that's why the center-left parties cannot compete with them? What is the reason?
Oh, okay. There are a great many factors there. Yeah, I mean, obviously, social media is part of the story, but let's take Turkey, since you mentioned Turkey. Okay, let's take that as an illustration of some of the tendencies of our times. So what's very interesting about Turkey is that the Justice Party, I'm taking the short form of the name of the party, right? They have become extremely popular in the rural area. Now, you may be aware of the fact that in Istanbul itself, the party has not made much headway in the nation's capital. Okay, now that's very, very interesting. And by the way, I mean, we can actually look at different wards. Now, I'm not a specialist, by the way, but since I read about these things widely, that's all I do, right? Most of the day, just basically read and write. There are wards of Istanbul where you have immigrant populations which vote very differently than wards which have non-immigrant populations. Okay, and then their vote falls along different lines. So what am I doing here now? In answer to your question, I'm raising two other considerations because I'm saying they're part of a very complex picture. You have mentioned one factor which I've only tangentially raised, and that is the whole question of social media. Right? What place social media plays. And then I'll get to the two factors I said that come out of the little comment that I made. Social media, if I had to really give you a very blunt answer to that, on the whole, it is definitely supportive of authoritarianism. That is that the tendencies will be in that direction. Now, I am well aware of the fact that activists, such as in Burma, okay, in the pro-democracy movement have used Instagram and they've used Facebook and Twitter and all of that to actually get people together. But I hope nobody here is going to tell me that before social media didn't exist, we didn't have mass movements. In fact, we had much greater mass movements before social media. Okay, and you might remember that in Tehran, in Tahrir Square, that gathering that took place 11 years ago, which was massive, the Green Revolution, that was not largely on account of social media. Yes, there was some internet influence there, but it was not largely on account of that. And this is not even taking care of, by the way, all the kinds of massive gatherings of people that were made possible during the periods before social media became important. We shouldn't assume that social media is to be supported merely because it facilitates these pro-democracy movements. The more important question is, how does it actually militate against social justice movements? 25 years ago, when the internet started to become important, I wrote one of the first very long articles published in Diaspora, a 40-page piece on how Hindu nationalists were using the internet, okay, to mobilize. And the Simon Wiesenthal Center, 20 years ago, brought out a mega CD disc listing thousands of anti-Semitic internet sites. The far right uses the internet far more effectively even today than the left does. I have absolutely zero doubt about that because I've looked at the data from a number of different sources. So therefore, for that reason, I cannot give my unequivocal assent to the idea that social media can be a force for the good. It could be, but I think on the balance, it's a force for the worse. That's what my assessment would be. Now, going back to the point I made. See, we can bring into, if we were to do, that's why this is subject really for 10 lectures and 2 books. If we had to do a full-scale analysis, see, we'd have to look at, for example, something like the rural-urban divide. In many countries, this is very important. Very important. You see that in the US. They call it the blue-red, but you can also do it as urban-rural. Right? The blue areas are going to be the metros, the big metros. Right? You go to Kentucky, you go to Wyoming, you go to Idaho, largely Republican. Right? So it's the urban-rural divide, which is exceedingly important. The second point is a point which I will only mention really, in a very, very succinct manner, because it's really something that requires a much longer kind of discussion. That is that one of the fundamental tensions in the modern world is between mobility and immobility. The figure of the migrant is critically important for our times. Now, their people have always been on the move. In fact, we're in a country which is a country of immigrants, as is a country like Australia, Brazil, Argentina, New Zealand, Canada. But even countries that are not countries of immigrants have always had internal migration, substantial international migration. There is this very complicated question, however, which I am using metaphorically, not simply in terms of immigration history. That is the figure of those who move and the figure of the who doesn't move. Modern states are feeling increasingly threatened by the figure who moves. In that sense, metaphorically, from the point of view of the modern state, anyone who's a migrant, who's moving, who's a refugee, and who's also migrating with his ideas, is like the Roma. You know, the Roma, or the Gypsies as they're called, they are despised in all of Europe. And one of the reasons for that is because they don't follow rules of bourgeois domesticity. You can't control them. How do you survey people who continue moving, who don't pay property taxes because they don't have a house, who don't have an electricity connection? This completely unsettles the state. And if I may put this on a parting note, our task as citizens is to try to unsettle the state. This is what we are commanded to do, I would say. We should use the figure of the migrant, the person who moves, as a metaphor for our own inspiration.
And on that note, that is the fabulous ending. We definitely need to unsettle the state. And it is, I am humbled by how you were able to get so much into this time at our meeting, and we need to have you back. There's no way that we can talk about the global turn to authoritarianism in such a short time. And I hope you've viewed some of the comments in the chat that are complimenting you and are asking you to come back. So
thank you.
And are actually adding to some of the things that you were saying. So
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.